Yes, well, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, whatever. And thanks again to Alex and to the Institute for organizing this series of seminars, which have been really informative and provocative so far. And thanks also, it's nice to be here in Loughborough in person as well, to meet some of my fellow presenters. So I'm going to talk, as Alex mentioned, I'm going to talk about nonviolent resistance, political power, and social change. What is the connection between each of these, and try to draw some conclusions. So understanding the connection between nonviolence and different dimensions of political power can help explain both the strategic effectiveness of nonviolent political action in achieving specific political objectives, as well as the contribution nonviolence can make to achieving deeper structural changes to societies permeated with multiple types of both direct and structural violence. So that's my kind of opening thesis. So power as cooperation is the basis not only for the effectiveness of nonviolent political action, but also for the type of society that can be constructed through the use of nonviolence. The ultimate objective of nonviolence is to create forms of social and political organization that challenge and replace power as domination in the form of direct and structural violence with power as cooperation. So I'm going to look at some of these themes and then move on to a few suggestive examples. So I begin with the conventional binary distinction between power as cooperation or power with, and power as domination or power over. So power as cooperation depends upon our ability to work together to achieve shared or agreed goals or objectives. Kenneth Boulding, in his book, The Three Faces of Power, refers to this form of power as integrative power, which he distinguishes from threat power. Nonviolent political action is a form of such cooperative or integrative power, or as David Courtwright has said, collective action based on mutual consent. So a central theme of nonviolence theory and practice is that power as domination depends upon cooperative power, or our capacity for collective action, which is the primary form of power, and that this helps explain the effectiveness of nonviolent action or civil resistance in achieving political and social change through the withdrawal of cooperation or compliance with systems or structures of domination and oppression. So again, Hannah Arendt, in her book On Violence, says to speak of nonviolent power is redundant because cooperative power, or our capacity to work together collectively to achieve shared objectives, is essentially nonviolent. Violence, as she claims, is not a source of power, but is actually the antithesis of power, understood in its primary form as cooperative collective action. So we can see nonviolent political action as both a negative and a positive expression of integrative or cooperative power. Nonviolent political action in the form of popular mobilization through civil society organizations and social movements is itself an expression of integrative power or social solidarity. On the other hand, nonviolent political action also challenges and undermines the integrative power necessary for the functioning of existing social structures and forms of political organization through non-cooperation and disobedience. And as such, can be viewed as a negative expression of integrative power, or what we might perhaps describe as its inverse, disintegrative power. So again, to go to some themes common in the literature about nonviolence, nonviolent political action utilizes what is often referred to as the consent theory of power, which forms a common theme in much of the literature. The consent theory also identifies power as based in social and political cooperation, including relations of cooperation and obedience between individuals or social groups or social groups with governments or ruling regimes. According to the consent theory of power, governments or ruling elites depend ultimately on the compliance, obedience, and cooperation of those they claim to govern. This extends to political institutions such as the state, which depends on the compliance and obedience of citizens, subordinate social groups, and those involved in intermediate bodies constituting its apparatus of administrative and coercive control, such as the police, the court system, the military, and the civil service. So this consent can be withdrawn through various forms of nonviolent popular resistance involving large sectors of the population or even specific sections of the state apparatus, such as civil servants, the security forces, or workers in key industries. So when we see civil resistance contributing to processes of social or political change, it's often through the withdrawal of this type of compliance or obedience with specific sectors of society or the state. So the power of ruling elites and structures of governance is not monolithic, permanent, and self-generated. Its dependence upon multiple sources of power within a society and upon the consent of the governed makes it vulnerable to challenge by civil resistance and nonviolent political action. So what does this mean then in terms of processes of political change? So Hallward and Norman, in their useful anthology from 2015, point to an important distinction between revolutionary nonviolence, which seeks to fundamentally change social structures and patterns of relations that cause and sustain conflict. This is a direct quote. And reformist nonviolence, which seeks to change leaders or policies. The tactics of nonviolent political action are often used to provide effective responses to particular grievances or the denial of particular social, political, or economic rights. This would be the more reformist end of the spectrum. So nonviolent civil resistance provides effective opposition to specific instances of oppression or injustice, but it can also be connected to the more transformative or revolutionary objectives of nonviolence because it involves resistance to power as domination. The ultimate objective of nonviolence is to create forms of social and political organization that challenge and replace power as domination in the form of both direct and structural violence. So this involves a shift from a more instrumentalist or reformist view of nonviolent political action as a series of tactics or methods to a more transformative or revolutionary vision of nonviolence as a source of alternative forms of social and political organization based on power as cooperation rather than power as domination. Now, the reformist and the revolutionary dimensions of nonviolence can be seen as complementary rather than contradictory. Proponents of nonviolence recognize the importance of working to achieve more immediate reformist objectives, even where they are committed to these more transformative or revolutionary goals. Because obtaining such immediate reformist objectives can sustain the momentum of long-term transformative campaigns and can also contribute incrementally to establishing the different components of a nonviolent society based on cooperative power. So now I'll just discuss a few examples that possibly support some of these ideas of a more transformative or revolutionary approach. So one example of this more transformative view of the objectives of nonviolence could be Gandhi's constructive program of social change connected to his normative concepts of Sarvodaya, or well-being for all, and Swaraj, or self-rule. Gandhi's constructive program involved building parallel structures or forms of social and political organization to replace those that were being challenged and dismantled. And he viewed this as an essential part of resistance to British colonialism, or perhaps even the ultimate goal of this struggle for Indian independence. So Swaraj, or self-rule, is achieved and sustained by the collective action and human agency that we can connect to cooperative power. Similarly, Sarvodaya, or well-being for all, involves power as cooperation, replacing power as domination in order to reduce or eliminate structural violence and systems of oppression, and to meet fundamental human needs. So Gandhi implemented his understanding of Swaraj, or self-government, in Sarvodaya by means of this constructive program of political and social change, which covered everything from village hygiene to the removal of the caste system in India to Hindu-Muslim unity. The specific components of Gandhi's version of the constructive program reflected the requirements of its Indian context, but it was meant to demonstrate in a practical way the elements of a society based on principles of nonviolence, Swaraj, and Sarvodaya. So moving towards this more constructive or transformative view of the objectives of nonviolence. So the constructive program, as Nurada Viravelli has said, was intended to conduct experiments that would transfigure the very institutions, structures, and culture of society into a civilizational experiment in nonviolence. That's a direct quote from her book on Gandhi in Political Theory. In other words, the constructive program exemplified the integrative power, or power's cooperation, by combining nonviolent action with both a practical program and deeper processes of social and political reconstruction. As Halvard and Norman suggest, such an approach emphasizes the constructive nature of nonviolence, which seeks to create new social structures or new patterns of relationships rather than simply destroying the existing ones. The Gandhian concept of Swaraj, self-government or self-rule, encapsulates the implications of cooperative power for nonviolence, not merely as a political method, but as providing the content of alternative forms of social and political organization. The critical tension here is between Gandhi's conception of self-rule, or Swaraj, which is often linked to the idea of home rule, this idea of an independent Indian state, but it goes beyond that. So the tension is between Swaraj and state sovereignty, or the state as a form of political organization. Swaraj revolves around human agency, and as a form of integrative or cooperative power is essentially nonviolent, as Hannah Arendt has pointed out, while state sovereignty depends on hierarchical structures of power as domination and violence for enforcement and control. Gandhi's ideal was to replace imperial rule not with a highly centralized bureaucratic state reliant on institutionalized violence, but with a decentralized democracy based on cooperative power from below. Gandhi, for example, as Kurt Schock has said, envisioned the central government devolving much of its power and decision-making to local villages. And there has been, of course, much written on affinities, or maybe lack of affinities, between Gandhi and some of these ideas. So to move on to the second point that might help illustrate some of these ideas, and to link this critique of the state and state violence to anarchism and anarcho-pacifism. So the anarchist and pacifist Bart de Ligt, in his book, The Conquest of Violence, also used the term self-government, which he contrasted with the violence of the state. As Delict said, if the masses of the people really raise themselves, they will substitute for the violence of the state the freedom which comes from self-government. Anarchism, I think, can be linked to some of these ideas around transformative or revolutionary nonviolence because it incorporates a critique of state violence and other forms of domination, as well as a vision of a society based on equality, freedom, and human dignity that coincides with transformative nonviolence and cooperative power. In this way, anarchism or anarcho-pacifism can perhaps provide a useful corrective to an exclusively pragmatic or instrumentalist view of nonviolence as a set of political tactics or techniques limited to either defending or attaining liberal democratic institutions based on the state and capitalism. So again, according to Kurt Schock, scholars of civil resistance have traditionally drawn from Gandhian and anarchist assumptions that prioritize the social roots of power, or this idea of power as cooperation, instead of state structures and political institutions. Thus, themes from anarchism or anarcho-pacifism can support a commitment to nonviolence as a form of political action that is connected to cooperative power and to a more fundamental challenge to the structural sources of domination, oppression, and violence. Benjamin J. Pauly also links an affinity between, or identifies an affinity between nonviolent political action on the one hand and anarchism on the other, that illustrates this capacity of nonviolence to campaign for fundamental social and political change, to move beyond nonviolence as the set of tactics and methods, and to develop innovative and effective mechanisms or strategies for achieving such change. This affinity revolves around a critique of the militarized state. So this is the affinity between transformative nonviolence and anarchism or anarcho-pacifism. So this revolves around a critique of the militarized state, the benefits of the tactics and strategies of nonviolence for anarchist political activism, and also a shared vision, a positive vision of a society built around cooperative power rather than power as domination. So again, this is a direct quote from Pauly. The constructive program, Gandhi's constructive program of Sarvodaya, bore a strong resemblance to anarchist ideas about social organization and coincided with the anarchist vision of a stateless society. So anarchism and nonviolent political action or civil resistance can be seen as complementary, because here, for the first time, as Pauly says, was a seemingly viable way of making revolution using neither state power, the kind of anarchist strand, nor violent insurrection, the kind of transformative nonviolence strand. So in conclusion, nonviolent political action as is a form of resistance against oppression and injustice that utilizes cooperative power effectively against specific instances of power's domination. The consent theory of power that features prominently in many theories of or approaches to pragmatic nonviolence uses the inverse of cooperative power in the form of disintegrative power to challenge and remove the compliance and obedience necessary to sustain unjust policies and practices. The aim of nonviolent political action, however, is not only immediate resistance to oppression and injustice, as important as this is, but also to build new forms of social and political organization that will supersede or eliminate the direct and structural violence embedded in our current societies. Both Gandhi's constructive program and anarchism or anarcho-pacifism provide insights into and agendas for achieving these new forms of society and community that increasingly embody integrative or cooperative power and are based on the reciprocal and mutually supportive relationship between cooperative power and transformative nonviolence. Thank you.